I realized something was wrong the moment the teacher started praising words I had written but didn't say my name. I watched my cousins smile calmly, accepting credit that didn't belong to them, while my chest felt painfully tight. What hurt most wasn't the stolen work, it was the silence everyone expected from me. So I stayed quiet, even when it felt like swallowing the truth would choke me. Before the story continues, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss stories like this. Sometimes the quiet moments teach us the loudest lessons. I had always believed school was one of the few places where effort spoke for itself. If you worked hard, people noticed. If you stayed honest, things eventually balanced out. That belief cracked the day my cousin took credit for my project without hesitation. We went to the same school, same grade, same extended family gatherings. Everyone thought it was nice that we were so close. What they didn't see was how competitive things quietly were between us. Teachers compared us, relatives compared us, even classmates assumed we were similar just because we shared a last name. That project had been my escape. I stayed up late working on it, rewriting sections until the ideas felt clear and strong. I didn't ask for help. I didn't copy. I wanted something that felt like mine. When the presentation day came, I felt nervous but proud. I sat down expecting my turn to speak. Instead, my cousins stood up first. They spoke confidently, used my structure, repeated my key arguments almost word for word. The room nodded along. The teacher smiled. And I stayed seated. At first, I thought maybe they were nervous and just leaning too heavily on shared ideas. But then came the praise, the compliments, the recognition, all directed at them. No one looked at me. I waited for a pause, for someone to ask why our work sounded identical. It never happened. When class ended, people congratulated my cousin. Someone even joked about how talented that family is. I smiled weakly and said nothing. That silence wasn't because I didn't know what to say. It was because I suddenly understood something important. If I spoke up right then, it would sound like jealousy, like bitterness, like an excuse. My cousin knew that too. Later that day, they acted normal, friendly, almost relieved. They talked about how well everything went, as if we had collaborated equally. I nodded and listened. That's when the betrayal became clear. They weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. They had planned it. I replayed moments from the past few weeks, the questions they had asked me, the way they had requested to see what I was working on, the casual comments about how stressful school had been for them. I had trusted them. At home, my parents asked how school went. I said it was fine. At dinner, my cousin joined us and talked proudly about the presentation. Everyone listened. Everyone smiled. I stayed quiet. That night, I felt angry, but not explosive angry. It was heavier than that. It felt slow and sharp, like realizing you'd been standing on something unstable all along. I thought about confronting them privately, demanding they tell the teacher the truth, but something stopped me. If they were bold enough to take credit publicly, they wouldn't suddenly become honest in private. And if I accused them without proof, the situation could turn against me quickly. So I did nothing. The next few days were uncomfortable. Teachers treated my cousin differently. Classmates asked them for advice. They enjoyed it openly. I observed everything. I noticed how they struggled to answer follow-up questions, how their explanations became vague when asked to expand on ideas they hadn't truly developed, how they deflected responsibility by saying things like, "We'll get back to that." I didn't correct them. Instead, I focused on my next assignment. I worked quietly again, but this time I kept my process to myself. No drafts shared, no casual explanations, no helpful hints. My cousin noticed. They asked why I was being distant. I shrugged, said I was busy. That answer bothered them more than anger would have. Soon, cracks began to show. During group discussions, teachers started asking deeper questions. My cousin's confidence faltered. They tried to repeat old phrases, but without understanding, words sound hollow. I watched carefully. This wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. I didn't want to embarrass them or expose them publicly. I wanted the truth to surface on its own. Time has a way of doing that. What my cousin didn't realize was that by taking credit once, they had placed themselves under a spotlight they couldn't maintain. Expectations grew, pressure increased, and the person they were pretending to be required knowledge they didn't have. Meanwhile, I stayed consistent. I answered when asked. I explained calmly. I never compared myself. I never accused. People started noticing the difference. One teacher asked me to stay after class one day, not to accuse, just to talk. They asked how I approached my work, what my thought process was. I explained honestly. Their expression changed slightly, not shocked, but thoughtful. That was the moment I knew something had shifted. I walked home that day lighter than I had felt in weeks, not because justice had happened yet, but because I understood silence wasn't the same as surrender. Sometimes silence is strategy, and sometimes letting time do the rest is the most powerful response of all, especially when the truth doesn't need help revealing itself, it just needs patience. The days that followed felt strangely calm on the surface, but underneath, everything was slowly rearranging itself. I didn't announce any change in my behavior, yet people sensed it. I spoke less, listened more, and when I did speak, my words were precise. I no longer tried to prove anything. My cousin, on the other hand, was being pulled in the opposite direction. Teachers began expecting more from them. Questions came faster, deeper, and with less guidance. Compliments were replaced by curiosity, and curiosity, when it's not backed by understanding, can feel threatening. I watched carefully. I noticed how often they glanced at me during class now, not openly, but in quick checking looks, as if measuring whether I was about to say something. I never did. That silence unsettled them. At lunch one day, someone asked my cousin to help explain a concept from the project. They laughed it off and said they didn't remember every detail. The group laughed with them, but the moment passed awkwardly. I said nothing. Later that afternoon, the teacher asked the class to build on that same concept for a new assignment. Groups were formed quickly. Without discussion, I was placed in a different group from my cousin. I felt relieved. Working with others showed me something important. When I explained ideas, people listened. When they asked questions, I answered confidently. There was no need to compete or compare. Word spreads quietly in schools, not through announcements, but through patterns. Who understands, who doesn't, who contributes consistently. My cousins started to feel it. They approached me after school one day, trying to sound casual. They asked if I could help them remember parts of the old project. They joked about how overwhelming expectations had become. I looked at them and said gently that I was busy with my own work. That was all. They didn't argue, but their expression shifted. Not angry, worried. For the first time, they realized I wasn't going to rescue them from something they had created. At home, things felt tense. My cousin talked more, trying to impress relatives with school stories. I stayed quieter than usual. When praised for being humble, I smiled politely. Humility is easy when you're certain of your ground. Soon, the cracks became harder to ignore. A class presentation came up, one that required clear explanation and original thought. My cousin volunteered confidently, perhaps hoping to reassert control. Halfway through, the teacher stopped them. Not harshly, just with a simple question. They couldn't answer it. Silence filled the room, the kind that makes time stretch. My cousin tried to redirect that the explanation collapsed in on itself. The teacher nodded slowly and moved on. No accusation, no embarrassment, just a quiet acknowledgement that something didn't add up. After class, whispers followed. Not cruel ones, curious ones. People started reassessing what they thought they knew. I walked past it all without reacting. That night, I thought about how easily I could have forced this outcome sooner by speaking up, but I also knew that if I had, the story would have centered on conflict instead of the truth. This way, no one had to choose sides. The truth was choosing for itself. A week later, the teacher called both of us in separately. When it was my turn, they asked me to explain my original process. I did, step by step. I wasn't defensive, I wasn't dramatic, just honest. They thanked me for my clarity and said something I didn't expect. They said, "I had a feeling, but I wanted to be sure." That sentence stayed with me. They didn't promise consequences, they didn't say what would happen next, but I knew something had been acknowledged officially now. My cousin avoided me that evening. At dinner, they were quieter than usual. When school came up, they changed the subject. I didn't bring it up. Revenge, I was learning, didn't require confrontation. It required consistency. Soon, an announcement was made about individual assessments being emphasized more heavily in future grading. Group work would be supplemented with personal explanations. It was framed as an improvement, but everyone understood what had prompted it. My cousins struggled under the new structure. Without shared credit, without borrowed confidence, their performance dropped noticeably. Teachers didn't scold them, they simply adjusted expectations. Meanwhile, my work stood on its own. I didn't feel joy watching my cousins struggle. What I felt was relief. The weight I had been carrying quietly was finally lifting. One afternoon, my cousin confronted me, not angrily, but emotionally. They asked why I hadn't spoken up earlier, why I let things go this far. I thought about that question carefully before answering. I said I didn't want to fight, I wanted the truth to be clear on its own. They didn't respond right away. When they finally spoke, their voice was small. They said they hadn't meant for it to get so big, that they thought they could catch up later. That was the real secret. They hadn't believed the credit mattered. They hadn't believed the work mattered. They thought results could exist without effort. I didn't argue. Some lessons aren't learned through explanations, they're learned through experience. From that point on, our relationship changed. Not dramatically, not with hostility, but with distance. Boundaries formed naturally. I stopped sharing unfinished ideas. They stopped asking. At school, teachers treated me differently, not with favoritism, but with trust. They called on me more often, asked for my input, encouraged me quietly. I realized then that staying silent hadn't erased my voice. It had protected it. The betrayal was real, but so was my response. I hadn't needed to shout or expose anyone publicly. I hadn't needed to humiliate or accuse. I had let time, truth, and consistency do what confrontation never could. And as the year moved forward, it became clear that the person who had taken credit so easily wasn't prepared for what came next. Because once time starts revealing patterns, it doesn't stop halfway. And the rest of the story was already unfolding in ways neither of us could undo. As the semester moved forward, the shift became impossible to ignore. My cousin no longer carried that effortless confidence they once had. They still tried to speak up in class, but now their words were careful, almost rehearsed, like someone walking on thin ice. I noticed something else, too. They had started watching me the same way I had once watched them, quietly, cautiously, trying to understand what I knew and when I might speak. It was strange being on the other side of that awareness. Teachers began assigning more independent tasks, essays, presentations, explanations that required personal understanding. There was nowhere to hide behind shared work anymore. For the first time, our paths at school truly separated. I found myself being invited into advanced discussions, asked to help younger students, encouraged to join academic programs I hadn't even known existed. None of it came with applause. It came with responsibility, and I welcomed it. My cousins struggled more openly now, not failing but floundering. They turned in work that felt rushed. Answers lacked depth. Teachers offered guidance, but the effort to improve had to come from them. At home, the change in dynamics was just as noticeable. Relatives who once praised my cousin's talent started asking me questions instead. Not comparisons, just curiosity. They wanted to know what I was interested in, what I was working on, what I planned to do next. I answered politely, never mentioning the past. My cousin grew quieter in those moments. One evening, while everyone else was distracted, they sat beside me and said something unexpected. "I didn't think it would matter this much," they admitted. I looked at them, waiting. They said they thought school success was about looking confident, about appearing capable. They hadn't realized how quickly that illusion collapses without substance. I told them gently that confidence isn't something you take from someone else's work. It grows from your own. They nodded, but I could tell the realization hurt. That wasn't my goal, but it was inevitable. The real turning point came during a school review meeting. Students were asked to reflect on their progress and challenges. When it was my cousin's turn, they hesitated longer than usual. Then they spoke honestly. They admitted they had relied too much on others, that they hadn't put in the effort they should have, that they wanted to change. No names were mentioned. No accusations were made, but everyone understood. I felt something loosen in my chest as I listened. Not satisfaction, closure. Because the truth had finally been spoken by the person who needed to say it. After that, things slowly began to heal. Not back to what they were before, but into something more realistic, less competitive, less performative. My cousin started asking for help differently. Not shortcuts, but guidance. Sometimes I offered it, sometimes I didn't, and that choice was mine. The revenge I had imagined early on never came in a dramatic moment. There was no public confession, no apology in front of a crowd. Instead, there was accountability. They carried the weight of their choice quietly, just as I had once carried the weight of staying silent. That symmetry mattered. By the end of the year, teachers knew exactly who had earned what. There was no confusion anymore. Grades reflected effort. Recommendations reflected consistency. When recognition came my way, it felt earned, not stolen, not shared without consent. And when my cousin succeeded later on, it felt genuine too. I realized then that what I had done wasn't about waiting for them to fail. It was about refusing to participate in something that wasn't true. Silence had given me space. Time had given me proof. And restraint had given the truth room to breathe. Not every betrayal ends with revenge that looks like punishment. Some end with lessons that reshape people permanently. And as graduation approached, I understood something important. If I had spoken too early, the story would have been about conflict. Because I waited, the story became about growth, mine and eventually theirs. That didn't erase what happened, but it gave it meaning. And when I thought back to that first day, sitting in the classroom while someone else accepted praise meant for me, I no longer felt that sharp ache. I felt calm, because I had learned that silence, when chosen with purpose, isn't weakness, it's trust. In yourself, in time, and in the quiet certainty that truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. It only needs room. And I had given it exactly that, all the way until the final chapter unfolded and showed me just how far patience could carry someone who refused to betray themselves in the process. By the time the year was coming to an end, the air at school felt different. Not lighter exactly, but clearer. The kind of clarity that comes when unspoken things finally settle into their proper place. People knew where they stood. Teachers trusted patterns they had seen over time. Nothing felt rushed anymore. I noticed how my cousin carried themselves now. Less performative, more careful. There was a humility there that hadn't existed before, not because they had been humbled publicly, but because reality had quietly corrected them. We didn't talk about what happened directly. We didn't need to. Some things don't require revisiting once they've done their work. I focused on finishing strong. My assignments reflected my thinking without anyone else's voice layered on top. When feedback came back, it was specific, thoughtful, and personal. That meant more to me than praise ever could. One afternoon, a teacher asked me what I planned to do next year. The question wasn't casual, it carried expectation. I answered honestly, explaining interests I had kept mostly to myself before. They listened carefully and encouraged me. That moment felt like confirmation, not just of my work, but of my decision to stay quiet when it mattered most. At home, things had softened. My cousin didn't avoid me anymore. They didn't compete either. We existed side by side, not as rivals, but as individuals with different strengths and responsibilities. One evening, they thanked me. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just a simple acknowledgement that I hadn't embarrassed them when I could have. I told them I hadn't stayed quiet for their sake. I stayed quiet for mine. That answer seemed to land. What surprised me most was how much confidence I had gained without anyone noticing the moment it happened. I no longer felt the need to prove ownership loudly. I trusted that my work would speak even if it took time. And time, as it turned out, was the most reliable ally I could have chosen. As graduation approached, there were awards, recognitions, and recommendations. Names were called, achievements listed. Nothing felt stolen anymore. Everything felt placed where it belonged. When my name was mentioned, there was no shock in the room, just quiet acceptance. That meant everything. I thought back to the moment when I first realized what my cousin had done. The confusion, the heat in my chest, the urge to speak up immediately. If I had followed that urge, I might have won the moment and lost the outcome. Instead, I waited, and because I waited, I kept my integrity intact. Revenge didn't arrive as punishment. It arrived as truth settling in permanently. My cousin learned something about shortcuts. I learned something about restraint, and both lessons mattered. Not every injustice needs an immediate response. Some need distance. Some need observation. Some need you to trust that your consistency will eventually expose what confrontation never could. I don't regret staying quiet. I regret that I had to. But I'm grateful I knew when to. Because in the end, letting time do the rest didn't mean doing nothing. It meant choosing patience over impulse. And that choice changed everything.